All right, so I just have a few more things to get through for us to finish off this self lecture. Due to our technical difficulties this morning, thanks to the power outage and the not working lectern, we fell a little behind. So based on class vote, you asked that I put the rest of it online instead of carrying it over into our social cognition week next week. So here goes. Where we left off was talking about how our need for positive self-regard can motivate us to, let's say, engage in certain self-deception strategies where we will use certain cognitive biases to help us self-enhance, make us feel good about ourselves. In fact, as sort of illustrated in this little comic here, often our motives to self-enhance are more powerful than our motives to self-verify. Self-verify is to find out what is true about ourselves, whereas self-enhancement motives are to find out what's great about us, and it may or may not be true. We don't really care. It's okay. So I compare this to sometimes if I present people with the option where in my right hand I've got an envelope that will tell you only the truth about yourself, and in my left hand I have an envelope that will tell you only good things about you. Then a lot of people will choose to hear only the good things. Again, whether they're true or not is less important as whether or not they're good. And so aside from people who, say, suffer from depression or chronically low self-esteem, we are generally motivated by this need for positive self-regard, and it leads us to hold certain illusions about ourselves. One of those, which we discussed in class, and which I illustrated with the memes that you guys had, was the above average effect, that we tend to think of ourselves when comparing ourselves to others, this generic others, as better than. We often also overestimate our ability to get things done. Anyone who has left writing that paper to the night before, thinking that they would be able to write it in just like an hour or 2 hours, might be suffering from what we call the planning fallacy. And that is when you underestimate how long it's going to take you to accomplish a particular task. We may call this procrastination, but whenever it comes to affecting your planning and that you have this illusion that you can accomplish it in the short amount of time, that's actually a planning fallacy. It's not just procrastination, putting it off and putting it off. It actually comes in play whenever you do believe that you could still get it done. We also, as we talked about the first day of class, with regard to attribution biases, we have these illusions and these self-enhancement views of our own actions. And we see that with the self-serving bias, that whenever we engage in something good and our actions have a positive outcome for us or those who are important to us, we attribute that to us being good people, our own skills, our own abilities. We make those internal attributions. But whenever we have a behavior that results in maybe not such positive outcomes for us or those we care about, then it's not really about our internal character or our personality, but it's about some sort of external factors. We made external attributions to sort of save ourselves from feeling blame or responsibility for those negative actions, or thinking that there's something intrinsically wrong with us that this action came about and this outcome, this negative outcome came about. We also, even though I've just educated you about the above average effect and the planning fallacy and the self-serving bias, which we've talked about before, we even have illusions about our own biases. And so despite having learned about all of these things, most people continue to exhibit what we call a bias blind spot, where they'll say, okay, well, maybe other people are exhibiting the above average effect, like in the Mary Roach in this video that we watched in class. But if it were me, I mean, my evaluation of myself is honest. I am, in fact, above average. It's all these other people who are fudging or who are holding these illusions. And while others might just engage in unrealistic expectations about what they can get accomplished in a short amount of time, while I can really deliver, and I can think of past examples where this was the case, but of course our memory is selective and will confirm our pre-existing expectations and beliefs. So these are all these different sorts of cognitive biases that fall under the category of self-deception strategies that are largely in place to help us self-enhance and continue to maintain this positive self-regard, or generally positive self-worth. So these are just a sampling, though. There are other examples where this drive to have a positive self-image leads to other negative outcomes. And so this is one thing where Mark Leary suggested that the self, at least this aspect of the self, this need for positive self-regard, may be something of a curse. It can have negative consequences both for ourselves, our motivations, as well as for our relationships. So, for example, with regard to our relationships, there is a theory developed by Abraham Tesser called self-evaluation maintenance theory. And this is where he argues that our self-esteem, or that positive self-regard, is maintained by two essential processes: social reflection and social comparison. So reflection is sort of we sit and we look back about how we have performed on something, and then social comparison is that we then compare that performance of how we did to those who are closest to us usually. And sometimes if we reflect on something and it's positive, we can bask in reflected glory. Say, for example, if somebody close to us does something really good, we can sort of, feel good by sort of a proximity to them. So they did something great, they got an award, or say the Mississippi State Bulldogs do really well, then we can take a little of that glory for ourselves because of our association with them. But sometimes we engage in social comparison whenever somebody who is close to us outperforms us in an area that is highly relevant to our self-concept, and we are uncertain about our abilities in that particular domain. So, the Bulldogs do well. I'm not a football player. It's not really relevant to my self-concept, so I can bask in reflected glory, even though I'm pretty certain I'll do terrible if I ever tried to play football. But it's not relevant. It's not important to my self-concept. But whenever, say, a close colleague outperforms me or gets an award that we're both up for, a grant maybe, well, grants are highly relevant to my self-concept. It's important to me. It's important to my career to get them. And I might have periods of uncertainty about my ability to obtain them, having really good ideas that's not coming through and I'm not getting awards. And so if a colleague close to me gets a grant that we both tried out for and I didn't get it, it could cause this process where I go into this, well, now I need to engage in self-evaluation maintenance. And whenever these instances where we're outperformed by people who are close to us in a domain that is really relevant to our self-concept, so being a good researcher for me, and we're uncertain at the moment about our abilities within that domain, so say I haven't gotten a good grant in a long time, I really need a win, then I'm forced into this situation where I have to make one of two choices. I can either distance myself from the friend who got the grant, who's outperforming me, or I can devalue how important it is for me to get grants and say, you know what, I think I should focus more on teaching instead and make that the focus and the element that is important in determining my self-esteem. So this is a classic experiment that I'm going to show you where Abraham Tesser sort of set up an experiment where he makes people uncertain about their abilities in an intellectual domain amongst college students who usually value that they are viewed as smart, and sees how it is that they respond. Do you see what they'll do? Unfortunately, is a lot of them will choose to sabotage their relationship and make their friend underperform so that they can feel better about themselves by comparison. Here we go.
Here now is Stone Phillips.
It's some people who thought they were friends.
If there is a way in which I can outdo you or I can prevent you from outdoing me, and I can do it in a way that lets me feel comfortable about myself, I might take that opportunity.
Abraham Tesser, listen to him. He's one of the top research psychologists on the subject of envy. A professor at the University of Georgia, he's an expert on the darker corners of the mind.
Why do people feel so guilty when they have feelings of envy?
Envy is one of the 7 deadly sins in the Bible. We're not proud of those feelings because sometimes they can lead to destructive behavior.
Envy,
Wanting what someone else has. It's all in your head, but it's that pit in your stomach. All those feelings that seem closer to the heart.
To understand just how overwhelming the emotion of envy can be, Professor Tesser needed to design an experiment that would show when people's envy of their friends start to make them behave more like enemies. So he came up with a game that he repeated for Dateline's hidden cameras.
We want you to relax and enjoy this exercise.
University of Georgia students thought they signed up for a psychological study on friendship. They even had to bring one friend with them. But this was really a test for envy.
In just a minute, we're going to ask the four of you to participate in a verbal skills exercise.
The game is like password. From a list of 10 words, 3 people seated in the back of 3 booths are asked to choose a word they think will best help the person in the first booth guess a word.
The first clue is punch.
Drink.
That's not correct.
The students are told the words at the top of their suggested clue list are the easiest clues. The ones at the bottom, the least helpful, with number 10 being the hardest.
The next clue is sand.
But this game is fixed.
Desert.
No, that's not correct. Clue 3, please.
The moderator is purposely giving the subject in the first booth tough clues so he'll do poorly and be embarrassed in front of his friend and the other students.
Again, using this formula, it indicates that you also scored below average.
Then they change seats, and this is where the science starts. The demoralized subject now has to decide how helpful he'll be to the others when it's his turn to give the clues. When it came to helping total strangers, most of the subjects gave the easier, helpful hints.
The third clue is dirt.
Soil.
Soil is correct.
But would they do the same for their own friend?
Did the results surprise you in the original experiment?
They did. From a commonsensical point of view, you would think that people would be kindest to their friends.
Look at the clue the subject offers to his friend for the word tree. His choices include oak or pine, but he chooses poplar, number 7. On the word strike, he could give clues such as hit or punch, but he chooses number 9, afflict. Did envy play a part in the types of clues he gave to his friend?
I thought that if I chose the harder word, that he would guess the correct word because he's got a really good vocabulary.
Perhaps that's true, and he wasn't trying to undermine his friend at all. In fact, we heard that kind of response numerous times from different students, that they picked a clue even if it was listed as a harder one because they know their friend and how they think and thought that clue would be most helpful. But Professor Tesser put some really unusual clues on the list.
You put some real Lulus in some of these lists.
Yes, sir.
Words that, even though they appear on a list of clues, no one in their right mind would use them as an assistance to anyone else.
It seems like, to the extent they're choosing this for the other person, it doesn't seem like they're trying to make the other person do well on this task.
Take a look at what happens with this student. He's already been told he performed poorly on the test. What will happen when it's his turn to give clues to his friend? Will he try to help or stick it to him?
Or you thinking, I'm going to really help Jason out here, or, well, I'm going to be darn sure that Jason gets out of here with a below average too.
Well, I think kind of not really helping him out, but not really, going after him.
For the word late, the subject's list of clue choices include tardy and overdue, but he chooses moratory.
You chose as the very first clue to give to your friend Jason the word moratory.
I chose moratory?
Yeah, the number 10, it's right here, moratory. That was what you chose for Jason to say. Now, do you know what moratory means?
I have no clue.
You have no clue.
He's giving clues that he doesn't even know the meanings of. Is this proof of sabotage motivated by envy?
As a human being, it's very difficult to avoid feeling a threat to self-esteem, feeling envy.
So if you're looking for people who are envious to the point where they might sabotage you, don't look far away, look close.
That's where we feel that emotion most strongly.
So if you want to see any other examples, you could play the whole video for yourself. I'm worried, though, that I'm going to be hit on YouTube with a copyright infringement for posting that much of this video. So as you can see, in that example, they made college students who tend to value that they're viewed as intelligent, so something that's relevant to their self-esteem, feel uncertain about their abilities within that particular domain. And what you saw was that then they were more likely to sabotage those who were closer to them than those who were strangers. You might wonder, why were they sabotaging somebody closer to them? It's those who are closer to us that we're more likely to make self-comparison processes with. They're the ones who are not just usually close to us, but usually similar to us in some domain as well. And so we're more threatened by the outperformance of those who are close to us whenever, again, it's a highly relevant self-domain and we're feeling uncertain in it, than we are threatened by the accomplishments of others. So just be sure that you have the ability to know under what circumstances people in self-evaluation maintenance will sabotage a friend or devalue how important a particular domain is to them, as opposed to in other circumstances where if the domain isn't important to our self-concept, or we are really certain in our abilities within that domain, we don't feel threatened. We can feel happy whenever our friends outperform us or other group members. All right, the other things that we see that self-esteem can do to us, or this basic need to maintain positive and high self-esteem. Well, one, we see that over time it leads to inflated self-views and people exhibiting narcissistic characteristics. So people, we've seen over history as sort of been this self-esteem movement to make us feel good about ourselves no matter what, that it's led to higher and higher levels of narcissism within our population. We also find that it results in people engaging in what we call destructive self-presentation. So in order to help us fit in with certain groups, which makes us feel better about ourselves, we'll engage in different activities that the group is doing because we want to maintain the belonging, which makes us feel good. And so that's where some of the ways you see that peer pressure, for example, can lead people to engage in drug use or engage in high-risk behaviors, or the use of alcohol or smoking, or even going to lengths such as eating disorders, because they are desperate to maintain a positive self-view, which can come from the positive views that others have of you. And so we see people engaging in what we call destructive self-presentation, or engaging in behaviors that are actually harmful to the self in order to obtain acceptance. We also see that sometimes people engage in other sorts of self-defeating behaviors. So, for example, we see that some people will engage in what we call self-handicapping. What's self-handicapping? So whenever you are uncertain about how well you're going to do on a particular task that you have coming up, so say you're uncertain about how you're going to do on an upcoming exam. In order to maintain one's self-esteem, people can sometimes engage in self-handicapping, where they will do something like, you know, I can study later. I'm gonna stay up all night, or I'm gonna go out and party with my friends this evening, because, you know, it's really important for me to maintain social relationships. That's what's really, you know, college is about. And so they could then, whenever they inevitably don't get enough sleep, don't study enough, and don't do well on the exam, they can avoid making an internal attribution like, well, that was about me not doing well on this exam because I'm not smart, or I didn't study. And they could say instead, and blame it on, you know, the situation. My friends really wanted me to go out that evening, so it wasn't really about me. You know, in fact, I was doing something nice. I was helping my friends out, or I was going to be social with my friends. And so they can then get away from sort of blaming their bad performance on an, let's say, stable individual characteristic. So self-handicapping can help us protect that self-image whenever we are worried that we're not going to do well on something that might affect our self-esteem. The other thing people might do whenever they anticipate that they aren't going to potentially do well on something is just to avoid challenges altogether. And so, not that you can necessarily avoid the exam coming up in a class, but if you find out that a class is challenging, or that it's a difficult class, and it's going to challenge you in new and hopefully exciting ways, you don't necessarily find that all that exciting. And so what we find is that as a result of this big push for the self-esteem movement, that students who get told over and over again, like, get a trophy for just participating, as opposed to getting a trophy for actually performing well, that they are unlikely to then take on new challenges whenever those opportunities arise for us to challenge and better ourselves, because they don't want to put their self-esteem to the test. They don't want to take on a challenge and fail and face the negative consequences that has to their self-esteem. They'd rather just avoid challenges altogether in order to continue to maintain what may be, in fact, an inflated self-view that isn't based on actual accomplishments, just the perception of accomplishments. So all these consequences are reviewed in this video here.
When you praise children lavishly for easy things, why should that make them want to do hard things?
So you can watch this whole video. It's about the consequences of the self-esteem movement that came about in the 70s, where they thought that self-esteem was the end-all be-all of everything, and if we just fix it and we make everybody feel really good about themselves, then we wouldn't have all of these problems. But in fact, we actually see, I gave you all the Rosenberg self-esteem scale on the survey that you took before this class, and you guys did exhibit this above average effect. You had above average self-esteem. But you know which group actually will outperform college students on the Rosenberg self-esteem scale? Prisoners. Convicted felons have really, really high self-esteem. And so that goes to show that we often just put too much emphasis on maintaining a positive self-view without actually making sure that that self-esteem, that positive self-worth, is actually based in anything. All right, so feel free. I encourage you to watch this video about feeling good about failure and the self-esteem movement to further understand the consequences of this drive to maintain positive self-regard. All right, I'm going to stop there. Hopefully YouTube lets me post this video and I don't have to do it again. All right, talk to everybody next week.